So thanks, Kevin, again for all the work you've done. Thanks for having me on this. I think I was one of the first few guests, I believe, in the
Yeah, number two guess. I think it was
number
December.
two, and
Yeah,
I think it was the week between Christmas and New Year's, and there were some technical challenges, so it wasn't the most it wasn't the greatest performance I think ever. So hopefully I have a chance to do better this time. But anyway, I wanted to just go through some things with folks and have a nice open discussion. The first slide just sort of sets things up. It's been a roller coaster in terms of hype and sort of passion about the industry, both good and bad. But I think that's typical of any disruptive technology. And I think of quantum as a disruptive technology in the same category as things like electricity, radio and television, and the integrated circuit. When those technologies came, people didn't really know what they were going to do with them, and it took a while. I remember reading, I was alive for I was sort of a young adult for the PC surge, and I remember lots of people saying, why would you need a home computer? This makes no sense, because people didn't have a frame of reference of what it could ultimately do. And I think there's a little bit of that going on with quantum. People don't understand it, or they're not quite sure yet. They're trying to think about it as a super fast computer, but it's a lot more than that, and I'll get into some of that here. I'm not going to talk about superposition or entanglement or various qubit modalities or too much about specific players. There's plenty on the internet about that, and I've covered that in my blogs. Encourage you to read some of that there. But I do want to sort of just talk generally. I'll give you a little background on me to why maybe you want to continue to listen. So I'm a venture investor. I've been doing that for 15 or 20 years, mostly in advanced technologies, things like lasers and machine learning software, some sort of very esoteric life sciences. And so I've developed a bit of an aptitude for being able to speak both to the industry folks as well as to the investors who may or may not be as fluent with some of the industry dynamics. I think that skill is serving me well in quantum. I don't have a formal physics background, but I'm a lifelong fan of physics and quantum mechanics. I've been avidly reading about quantum mechanics, relativity, string theory for much of my adult life, and it sort of fascinates me. So quantum computing was sort of a culmination of some of those efforts. I'm not really a techie per se, but I did buy one of the very first computers that were available at Radio Shack, if for those of you that remember what Radio Shack was. But I bought a Sinclair ZX80 in probably 1980 or 1981. I think it had 8K of memory. It couldn't do very much. There weren't many resources on how to do things with it. I wrote a few programs just because I was curious and it was interesting. And I always regretted not doing more and kind of missing the whole PC wave that came shortly thereafter. I started a deep dive into quantum computing about a year and a half ago or so. I had some extra time on my hand with COVID, and I started reading articles, and something really caught my eye about the promise of quantum computing. So I thought the best way for me to learn about quantum is to teach, if you will. And so I decided to start a blog, and I've been focused on writing a blog from the voice of somebody who doesn't really understand quantum computing or its business applications, trying to use the blog as a way to explain that to people. And it's been a great project, really exciting, a lot of fun. And I've met some amazing people through it. It's propelled me to be ranked number 8 in the world on LinkedIn, for whatever that's worth. I've been a speaker and a panelist on a few things, and I was most recently one of the judges on Classic, who hosted a sort of an Olympics of quantum coding, which was a fascinating exercise. And there were hundreds of submissions from all over the world. And it was amazing the diversity of approaches people took to basic sort of problem sets. And so it was really fascinating to be a judge and see all of that. Some stuff about contacting me. So let's start with the quantum computing elevator pitch. There's probably a lot of ways people can do this. I like to do it from this perspective, that quantum computers will transform the way we use computers by massively accelerating certain computations, and more importantly, by enabling a wholly new form of computing. And I'm going to focus on that for a couple of slides here. And I think it's what really excites me about quantum. At the quantum scale, there's a particle wave duality. That's sort of fancy talk for the quantum computers are able to process information, a lot more information and a lot quicker, which provides speed up, but it also provides new approaches to problems. Those manifest in superposition and entanglement, which I won't get into. There's been a massive focus of resources globally, over $25 billion last year or so, from around the world, from various governments and private industries. The reason there's massive investment is because there's massive potential. We're at the cusp. I think there's so much potential that we're at the cusp of a transformative value creation. You think about what value was created by the integrated circuit. 8 of the top 10 market cap companies today are all sort of computing related. You've got Apple, Microsoft, and Google among the top 5. Microsoft and Google have nearly $2 trillion market cap. Apple's nearly $3 trillion. That's value created from technology that didn't exist when these companies started. And so I'm looking forward to see who the Apples, and Microsofts, and Facebooks of the quantum world will be. And then, people talk about there's applications for quantum. People mostly think about that in the framework of current computing. And they think about combinatorial, speed up. And that applies to things like molecules, which applies to things like medicine and batteries. There's applications in finance and logistics, et cetera. There's been a lot written about all of that. So I'm super excited about that. But what I'm really excited about is thinking outside the box. And a couple of quotes here just to frame this. This first quote, Esperanza Gomez, some of you may know, posted just a couple of days ago. She quoted Roger Martin, who's a professor, and said, if you can define the problem differently than everybody else, you can generate alternatives the others aren't thinking about. And I think that's going to be a key mantra in quantum, that people, and I saw this a little bit in the quantum, in the classic contest, people are approaching problems with a whole new toolbox. The computer logic of classical computers and not, there's a lot more gates in quantum computing that do different things. And so people are coming up with creative ways to use that gates to create algorithms to do interesting things. And I'm fascinated by that. And I think there's going to be a lot more of that coming. And then to those of you who remember Donald Rumsfeld, who was a Secretary of Defense among other prominent government positions, he sort of infamously was once quoted as saying, there are known unknowns, things that we don't know, but there are also unknown unknowns, things that we don't know, which is a bit of a tongue twister, but I like that. I think it's the what we don't know yet about what quantum computing can do that really, really excites me. Hopefully excites all of you too. A little bit about metrics on the industry. You guys are probably following this if you're reading about quantum. In 2021, it was a breakout year. There was over $3 billion invested in quantum companies. That included some very large initial public offerings and lots of venture investments. That's a pretty large number for sort of almost any business, certainly for a sort of startup industry. But you'll see in this graphic that sort of came to a screeching halt last quarter. And the disruptions in the markets and the uncertainty around interest rates and competing investments have really put the brakes on not just quantum, but most forms of private investment. There's a little bit of sort of change in that, a little blip. There's been a couple of recent financings, most prominently IQM, raised $130 million in Europe. And then Atlantic Quantum and Quix are two smaller companies that just raised money in the last couple of weeks. So there are still some companies getting funded, but it's going to be more challenging to get funding for quantum companies. And because there are some really well-funded and well-supported qubit, hardware companies already, I think it's probably past the point where you can seed fund a qubit or a new quantum hardware company. That's not to say there won't be a few more, but I believe it's going to take major capital to sort of get into that game. There's companies are way ahead in terms of qubit counts and systems, quantum computers that are running. So there's probably lots of seed investment opportunities in other parts of the industry, but I don't think in the hardware. I think I'm already seeing, I'm on the board of a biotech company that just did a very big financing with some prominent VCs. And when we did the financing a few months ago, our goal was to have two years of runway in the bank, which is what we funded as a $140 million financing. The first board meeting after that closed, which is just a couple of weeks ago, already everybody's saying, well, we really should have 3 years of runway. So how can we lower our spend to extend the runway? I think you're going to have similar conversations for the quantum companies. They're going to start to want to preserve capital and be careful and rationalize some of their spending. You're also going to see down rounds, and down rounds are painful for a lot of reasons. But I believe a lot of these quantum companies that got funded at really high valuations are going to struggle to keep those valuations, and they're going to need more capital, and so that's going to lead to down rounds, and that's going to potentially demoralize some employees who are given options and things like that. And then at the same time, I think you're going to see increased M&A activity. I think companies are going to run out of money, or companies are going to realize it's cheaper to buy a company to get all the talent versus trying to recruit and hire everybody themselves. So you're seeing a little bit of M&A already. I think you're going to see a lot more of that. But things are still pretty rosy, I believe. I think the industry is continuing to move forward. I like to quote the IBM roadmap, because they've been really good at putting this out in the public domain and reaching their early milestones. And I put in red, I highlighted by next year, they're going to have over 1,000 qubits available in what they're calling Condor. And they seem to be on pace for Osprey, which is going to have 433 qubits. So I'm optimistic they're going to meet their next milestone and potentially future milestones. Well, over 1,000 qubits, I think, is going to start to do some exciting things as error correction and other sort of efficiencies are laid on top of that. So I'm pretty excited to see how that happens. At the same time, there's dozens of quantum computers already available on the cloud. You can sign up, you can get an account, you can actually write algorithms, have them run on real quantum machines, not just simulators. And like I said, with the classic competition, people are doing this. You can go to the IBM site and see their metrics. They've got millions of registered users. It's pretty fascinating. And I think once there's 1,000 qubits available, the sky's the limit in terms of what people are going to start to do. So I'm still pretty excited about the trajectory the industry is on. Well, I want to just post a quick snapshot. This is a blog I wrote some months ago about collaboration, and the concept, the message here, the takeaway is that it's a pretty open industry. I've found that almost anytime I've reached out to somebody by phone or on LinkedIn or at an industry event, people are very open to talk. I think generally, even competing companies are open with each other. If you are early in your journey, or even if you're further along in your journey and you want to learn about a company or a situation, just reach out to someone at the company. I bet you they'll give you 15 minutes, and I bet that'll be a really productive use of your time. And I also want to mention that the quantum computing gets a lot of the headlines, and I've focused a lot on that in my writings because I'm so excited about it. But that's not to say there aren't other quantum physical properties that are being used already. And so quantum sensing, quantum communication are two big fields that already have revenues, already have products and customers, and already do some pretty remarkable things like navigation. In the case that where GPS gets attacked, the Russian-Ukraine war happened, and Russia jammed the GPS satellites from the Ukraine. And so if Ukrainian fighters had quantum sensors that could tell their positions, not needing GPS satellites, that's just one example. And so I know that the US defense is looking at a lot of these sorts of applications. A couple of challenges why it's not more, why quantum computing isn't more generally accepted or in the market, and some of these are pretty substantial, but there are at least there's progress being made in most of these. First one is quantum is hard to explain. Quantum computing is hard to explain. There aren't specific use cases that are actually in practice yet. So a lot of people sort of scratch their head or their eyes glaze over, or they're waiting to see. So there's a lot of sort of friction in gaining momentum because people are a little bit perplexed. There's also still a lot of noise. We were talking about this a little bit before the call started. There's a ton of environmental noise. There's noise inherent in qubits. There's noise that's created as you run deeper and deeper circuits. There are some ways people are dealing with noise and error correction, which is pretty creative and clever, and I think we'll see more and more of that. So as noise gets sort of tamed in this NISQ era, we'll see more and more advances and performance enhancements in computing. That said, there's no killer app yet. I think at some point people will talk about quantum computing when there's a specific app that they can reference and know about, and that hasn't quite happened yet. There's been talk about prospective areas. Shor's algorithm is one. There's sorts of logistics, and people talk about fertilizers. So there's certain areas where people expect quantum to make a huge impact, but none of them have happened yet. The other rate delimiter is talent pool. There's only, I think, 25 or so master's programs in quantum physics, quantum computing in the country, and they only graduate a handful of people a year. So the demand for that level of expertise is way ahead of the supply. And a lot of the people that are graduating from those programs stay in academia. So there's just a fraction of the talent pool is coming out of these universities each year. So people are going to have to get creative on how they fill this talent gap. But that's going to be somewhat of a rate delimiter to the whole market. The other thing, it's a little nuanced, but they talk about the quantum measurement problem. What that means is when you measure the qubit, it collapses to whatever state it's going to be measured in, and that stops the equation from happening. And so you can't just measure it, fix it, and keep going. That's why a lot of these error correction mechanisms are very sort of convoluted, because they're indirect, but they rely on lots of ancillary qubits to sort of carry the information and look for parity. That's one challenge that people are meeting, but still hasn't quite been met. The other thing is sort of somewhat related to that is, there's no quantum RAM. So you can't just store quantum information as you're running it and come back to it later. You sort of have to do it all on the fly and live. And that somewhat also applies to quantum communicating and optical networks that are being set up, that there's no quantum repeaters because some of this measurement problem issues. So that's still an issue people are wrestling with, finding creative ways to deal with, but still a major problem. And then, of course, we've got the industry has got lots of different people trying different methodologies of creating qubits and quantum hardware, and controllers for that. And there's a whole mishmash of competing technologies, if you will. There's sort of no kind of clear standard yet. And so it's a bit of a bake-off that's ongoing amongst these somewhat competing technologies. And it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. And then, of course, there's hype. There's talk of quantum winter. There's I don't know if you all saw, there was a Scorpion report written about IonQ that was 180 pages of frankly garbage. But my friend who forwarded it to me first said, "Oh, it's 180 pages. Some of it must be true." And I think that was the intention of the author, who was short the stock and wanted the stock to go down. That's just one example, but there's been more than just one person who's been bearish on the market and has written negative things about the promise of quantum. And of course, that's some headwinds in the industry. So there's still challenges. Some of these are significant. Most, though, have some sort of solution sets that are being applied to them. And I think with a little time and a little capital, a little ingenuity, these obstacles will be overcome. So what's next in the near term from my venture capital seat? I think despite the slowdown, it's still a good business, and good businesses will attract capital. Maybe the valuations will be different, but if you have a good idea, a good company, or a good solution, you're gonna get capital for it. So keep going. The other thing is, people sort of talk about this quantum supremacy, quantum advantage, as if it's going to be sort of some magic day where everybody says, "Aha, we're there." There was a little bit of that when a few years ago when Google announced their quantum supremacy with Sycamore. That's somewhat been challenged, but I think it's been generally accepted now because it's been repeated that people have found ways to run sort of contrived equations that may or may not have any applicability, but to run an equation significantly faster, or maybe sort of impossible to run on a classical computer. So that's just sort of a test, and I think people are waiting now for quote unquote quantum advantage, where the same could be true of a useful algorithm. I don't think that's necessarily what's going to drive the industry or what we should all be waiting for. You're going to have sort of incremental baby quantum advantages, especially in this era now where there's a lot of mixed high-performing computing and classical computing along with quantum. I heard Chad Rigetti on a talk not too long ago, said he was working on a weather prediction model with the weather, the big national weather service, and there was tiny pieces of that whole big sort of equation or analysis where the Rigetti quantum computers were able to add value to one small subset of the problem. And I think you're going to see more and more examples where quantum enhanced solutions are going to be in the headlines more and more. I mentioned the talent shortage. That's going to be hard to solve. People are going to have to get creative. They're going to have to come up with accelerated educational constructs. There's a ton of MOOCs or massive online college classes that people can take that already are available. I've taken some of them. I encourage you to look up some of them yourselves. They're pretty good. I think cross-training, people that have general computing chops but don't know quantum can be trained on the quantum side, and people that know physics and quantum that don't know computing could potentially be cross-trained on the computing side. And like I said, there's going to be M&A. People are going to fill in their talent holes with acquisitions. Cold Quanta recently bought SuperTech, a software company, and I think that was largely to get the dozen or so folks in Chicago that SuperTech had that Cold Quanta wanted. Also, this is a highly complicated industry with massive upside and massive opportunity. It's going to take a village, as they say, and so I think you're going to see a lot of collaboration amongst entities that don't necessarily collaborate all the time. I think you're going to see combinations of these between government, universities, and industry and high performance computing. So you'll see a lot more about that. And then, this is the space race of our generation. China is furiously trying to outpace us on many areas. I'd say it's pretty neck and neck. I think maybe the US has certain advantages on the computing side, but China has clear advantages on communications. They have a satellite, the Mickey satellite that's been launched a couple of years ago that's beaming QKD, from space, the first sort of proven quantum communication by satellite. They've got fiber optic networks set up where they're running networks on the ground, and so they've made great progress there. And I think U.S. is catching up, but the space race is on because both the upside payday, but also sort of the downside of having your secret communications hacked, for example, is huge. And so the race is on. Just about done here. A couple of resources to point out. Like I said, I'll make this presentation available. There's a few I want to point out for those of you that are sort of in your journey. Q is for Quantum is a book. It's a free download that's available, written by Terry Rudolph, who's both a professor and one of the co-founders of PsiQuantum, which is one of the sort of highest capitalized companies focused on 1 million qubits with optical computers. But Terry does a great job of explaining what superposition is without ever using the word superposition. It's a really clever, well done sort of intro for quantum. So Q for Quantum, I recommend highly. I think the other one I want to point out is this Essential Mathematics for Quantum Computing. It's a little more geeky for people, but if you really want to understand quantum, you're going to have to understand linear algebra, which is not intuitive. And this book sort of filters out all of the linear algebra noise of what's not required for quantum computing and focuses just on linear algebra as it relates to quantum computing. And it's a pretty approachable book. So I was looking for a long time for something like that. I finally found it, and I'm glad I did. These web aggregators are all pretty good. I encourage you to sign up for their email links. They'll send you periodic updates with all the key headlines, and you can go to their websites for some quick and easy categories and looking up things about companies or technologies, etc. On the online learning, there's a lot of that out there. This is just a sampling. I want to point out the first two. The Black Opal by Q Control is a phenomenal program. There's a free version and there's a modest premium version that is really clever. It goes through modules sort of one by one, and the sort of bite-sized learnings and little quizzes and Quizlets in the middle, and you earn badges as you go through them. But it's a really great thing if you're a visual learner like I am. There's a sort of a demo area where you can sort of play around and create gates and see what it does to the qubits. And so when first time I plugged in the Hadamard gate and saw the visual manifestation of how it rotated the qubit, it was like, oh, aha, now I see it. So it's a great way for visual people to learn about some of the basics of quantum. And quantum country it's an interesting, it's a hard to explain. It's a new form of learning, if you will, and it's really clever and it's really well done. It's written by one of the guys from the Mike and Ike textbooks on quantum computing, so well respected, and it's a great program. There's this quantum computing for the very curious. It's sort of the first of 4 or 5 modules, and I encourage you to go through those. There's a few others listed here. The research, some of these I highlighted have some really good summaries. If you go to the websites, BCG has great quantum-oriented papers, white papers that you can download for free. Rand Corporation does some phenomenal stuff. Again, you can download for free. and my MIT Technology Review. If you're not a subscriber already, I encourage you to. And they cover broad technologies, but they also cover quantum pretty well. And that's it for me. So thanks all for listening. I'm happy to chat, answer questions, have an open discussion, and anything else. So I'll open the floor.